The last train left Krasnova station at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and I was the only person on the platform who understood what that meant. Not the schedule, not the departure. I mean, the finality. I watched those taillights shrink into the tunnel like two red eyes closing, and I knew that nothing on rails would ever move through this city again. Above me, through 200 feet of concrete and compacted earth, the sirens had stopped. Not because the danger had passed, because there was no one left to sound them. My name is Adrian Calloway. I was 31 years old, a structural engineer contracted to the Krasnova Metropolitan Transit Authority. For 14 months, I had been mapping ventilation systems, stress fractures, and emergency infrastructure across the oldest section of the city's underground network. I knew every service corridor, every sealed maintenance hatch, every forgotten construction passage from the Soviet-era expansion that never appeared on any modern blueprint. That knowledge was the only reason I was still breathing. 6 days before that last train departed, a cargo vessel called the Meridian Star docked at the city's commercial port after 17 days of radio silence. Port Authority boarded the vessel and found the crew below deck. Most of them were dead. 3 of them were not, but they were no longer crew. The footage leaked within hours. Grainy phone video showed dock workers running across wet concrete, while something in a naval uniform moved with a speed that didn't match its shattered legs. By morning, the health ministry had issued a containment advisory. By afternoon, the airport closed. By the following dawn, containment was a word people only used ironically. I didn't panic immediately. Engineers don't. We assess load-bearing capacity. We calculate failure points. I spent those first 2 days watching the collapse from my apartment window on the 14th floor, cataloging the progression the way I would document subsidence in a foundation wall. Organized response, then strained response, then no response. Military vehicles appeared on the avenues, then burned on the avenues. The infected moved in patterns that shifted every few hours, first scattered, then clustering, then surging in corridors of movement that followed sound and light, like water following gravity. On the 4th day, my neighbor Dmitry Sokolov pounded on my door at 3 in the morning. Dmitry was a retired municipal plumber, 64 years old, built like a filing cabinet, with hands that could crack walnuts without effort. He had his teenage granddaughter, Lena, with him. She was holding a cat carrier with no cat inside it, just a small bag of medications and a flashlight. Dmitry's eyes told me everything his words didn't. The upper floors of his building had been breached. They had come through the stairwell. "Adrian," he said, "you know the tunnels." It wasn't a question. Dmitry had worked alongside me on the water main assessment beneath the transit hub. He knew exactly what I knew. And he knew what I'd once mentioned over coffee, that beneath Krasnova station, below the active platform level, there existed an entire decommissioned service complex from the 1962 expansion. Sealed off, structurally sound, accessible only through a maintenance shaft behind the electrical substation on the mezzanine level. I looked at Lena. She was 17. Quiet in a way that suggested the silence was protecting something fragile inside her. She met my eyes and didn't look away. That told me enough. "Get everything that fits in one bag each," I said. "Food, water, layers, medicine. We leave in 20 minutes. We left in 12. The streets were worse than the window had suggested, not because of the infected. At that hour, most had migrated toward the harbor district, where generator lights still attracted them. The streets were worse because of what the uninfected had done. Storefronts gutted. Cars overturned not by force, but by desperation. People trying to barricade intersections with anything available. The smell was layered. Smoke, gasoline. Something organic and sweet that I trained myself not to identify. Krasnova station sat 4 blocks north. We moved in silence, staying close to building walls, stepping over things I will not describe. Dmitri carried a crowbar. I carried a flashlight and a laminated transit map. I had never returned to the office. Lena carried everything else. The station entrance was a wide Soviet-era arch. Ornamental concrete pillars framing a darkened mouth that descended through motionless escalators into the concourse below. Emergency lighting still functioned on battery reserves. Dim amber strips along the floor that turned the marble wall the color of old teeth. The fare gates stood open, their electronic systems dead. Our footsteps echoed in a way they never did when thousands of commuters filled this space daily. The absence of people made the architecture enormous. "Stay between us," Dmitri murmured to Lena. She nodded and adjusted her grip on the cat carrier. I led them past the platform level, through a staff-only corridor marked with a faded placard reading "Maintenance. Authorized personnel." The door's electronic lock had failed to default position, but the manual override was a simple lever mechanism I had documented 8 months ago during a fire safety review. It opened without resistance, revealing a narrow concrete stairwell descending sharply. The air changed immediately. Cooler, denser, carrying a mineral tang of deep stone and stagnant water. "How far down?" Dmitri asked. 4 levels below platform, about 60 meters total depth. He grunted. Lena said nothing, but I heard her breathing quicken. The stairwell took 7 minutes to descend. At the bottom, a heavy steel door. Industrial, Soviet vintage. The kind designed to withstand pressure differentials in the event of a chemical attack. Stood slightly ajar. This was the entry to the 1962 service complex. I had first accessed it during a routine survey and spent 3 full days mapping its layout. The complex consisted of a central corridor, roughly 300 meters long, flanked by equipment rooms, a former command post, a water reservoir chamber, and a ventilation hub connected to the surface through 4 independent shafts. I pushed the door open. The hinges protested with a low groan that moved through the corridor ahead of us like a living thing. "Flashlights only from here," I said. The beams cut into a space that swallowed them. The corridor was wide enough for 2 service vehicles side by side, lined with conduit piping and cable trays that hung from the ceiling like mechanical vines. The floor was poured concrete, dusty but intact. No debris, no water damage. The structural integrity was exactly as I had assessed it. Sound, stable, and profoundly isolated from the chaos above. We moved 60 meters in before I chose our position. Equipment room. C4 was a rectangular space, approximately 15 by 8 meters, with a single entrance, a sealed ventilation grill, and a row of decommissioned electrical panels along the far wall. It had a concrete floor, a high ceiling, and, critically, no secondary access points. 1 way in, 1 way out. Defensible geometry. "This is it," I said. Dmitri surveyed the room with his plumber's eye for infrastructure. He tested the walls with his knuckles, checked the door frame, examined the ventilation grill. "Solid," he confirmed. "Grill is welded. Nothing bigger than a rat getting through that." Lena set down the cat carrier and sat against the wall. In the flashlight glow, she looked younger than 17. She pulled out her phone, checked it, put it away. No signal. Not down here. Not ever again. We organized our supplies in silence. Between the 3 of us, we had carried 18 liters of water in various bottles and containers, a collection of canned food that would last perhaps 10 days with rationing, basic medical supplies from Dmitri's bathroom cabinet, Lena's prescription medication, an anticonvulsant she took twice daily, with approximately a 3-week supply remaining, 2 flashlights, a battery-powered lantern, Dimitri's crowbar, a multi-tool from my work kit, and the laminated transit map that now represented the boundaries of our entire world. I pinned the map to the wall using strips of electrical tape from the panels. Under the lantern light, the complex revealed itself in blue and white lines. Corridors branching, rooms numbered, ventilation routes traced in dotted red. Our room was a small rectangle near the center. I circled it with a marker. "Home," I said. Nobody laughed, but Dimitri placed his hand on my shoulder, and Lena looked at the map the way someone looks at a locked door when they can't decide if it's keeping danger out or trapping them inside. That question would answer itself soon enough. The first night underground, I couldn't sleep. Not from fear, from silence. The depth stripped away every frequency I had learned to filter on through a lifetime of urban living. No traffic hum, no electrical buzz from appliances, no distant voices or barking dogs, or the low arterial pulse of a city moving through its hours. The silence below Krasnova station was geological. It pressed against the eardrums like water pressure, and within it, the smallest sounds became grotesque. Dimitri's breathing, the tick of cooling concrete, my own heartbeat, absurdly loud, as if my body was trying to convince me it was still working. Lena slept first, which surprised me. She curled against her bag with the empty cat carrier beside her, like a sentinel, and dropped into unconsciousness with a speed that suggested either exhaustion or the particular resilience of youth. Dimitri sat against the wall near the door, crowbar across his knees, watching the corridor through the gap he'd left open. "You should rest," I told him. "I've been sleeping 64 years, he said. "I'll watch." I didn't argue. I lay on the concrete with my jacket folded under my head and stared at the ceiling, tracing the conduit lines with my eyes, mapping them against the blueprint in my memory. The ventilation system fascinated me even now. 4 shafts, each running independently to different surface locations within a 3-block radius. They had been designed for air circulation during prolonged occupancy. The Soviet planners had built this complex as a potential shelter, and they had understood that breathable air was the first and most critical resource. The shafts were narrow, roughly 40 centimeters in diameter, fitted with manual dampers at each junction. Too small for a person, too small for anything human. I held on to that thought as I finally drifted into something adjacent to sleep. Dimitri woke me at what he estimated was 6 in the morning. Without sunlight or functional watches. His was analog but had stopped. Mine was digital and dead. Time became theoretical. We agreed to measure it by routine instead of hours. Wake, eat, explore, plan, rest. These became the pillars of our underground calendar. Breakfast was canned peaches divided 3 ways and a shared liter of water. Lena took her medication with mechanical precision, counting the remaining pills quietly and tucking the bottle back into the cat carrier with an expression I recognized. The arithmetic of dwindling supply, calculated against uncertain duration. "We need to know what's connected to this complex," I said, smoothing the transit map across the floor between us. "I've surveyed the central corridor and 4 adjacent rooms, but the complex extends further than I documented. These sections," I indicated a cluster of unmarked passages branching from the corridor's eastern end, "were sealed during my assessment. Locked doors, some welded shut. I didn't have authorization or reason to open them." "Now you have reason," Dimitri said. "And no one left to deny authorization," Lena added quietly. It was the first full sentence she had spoken since we arrived. Her voice was clear and measured, and it carried a dry precision that reminded me She was not merely a frightened teenager following adults. She was watching, processing, drawing conclusions. We spent that first full day exploring. Dimitri and I moved through the central corridor with the lantern, while Lena stayed in C4 with a flashlight and the agreement that she would barricade the door if we were not back within 2 hours. The corridor extended 300 meters as mapped, terminating in a heavy bulkhead door that was sealed but not locked. The locking mechanism had rusted into its open position decades ago. Beyond it, the complex continued. A second corridor, unmapped, branched at a perpendicular angle and stretched into darkness beyond the reach of our lantern. The air here was different, moving, carrying a faint, rhythmic draft that suggested active ventilation somewhere ahead. The walls were older, rougher, the concrete showing the texture of original formwork rather than the smoother finish of the renovated sections. Dimitri paused at the junction and aimed his flashlight into the branching passage. The beam traveled 40 meters before dissolving into black. "Someone built more than what's on your map," he said. "The Soviets always built more than what was on any map," I replied. We marked the junction and turned back. That passage would wait. But it wouldn't wait quietly. By the third day, we had established a functional rhythm that gave our existence underground, a shape resembling normalcy. Dimitri, with his decades of infrastructure knowledge, had located the water reservoir chamber I'd identified on the map. A vaulted room containing 2 concrete cisterns, each holding approximately 4,000 liters. The water was stale, mineral-heavy, but a quick test with the basic purification tablets from my work kit confirmed it was drinkable. That single discovery extended our survival timeline from days to weeks, and the relief that moved through our small group was physical. I watched Dimitri's shoulders drop 3 inches when I confirmed the results. Lena had quietly transformed C4 from a concrete box into something approaching habitable. She organized supplies along the wall in a system of her own design, separated food by caloric density, arranged the medical supplies in order of urgency, and created a small corner where she had hung a spare shirt from a pipe to create a privacy screen. She did all of this without being asked, without commentary, and with an efficiency that suggested she had been taking care of environments, and perhaps people, long before the world collapsed. "She's been managing my apartment since her mother left," Dimitri told me on the 3rd evening while Lena slept. We were sitting in the corridor outside C4, speaking in voices calibrated to the acoustics of deep stone. 3 years now. Cooking, cleaning, making sure I take my blood pressure medication. 17 years old, and she runs a household better than anyone I've known. Her mother, my daughter, went to Germany for work. Was supposed to send for Lena when she was settled. He paused. That was 2 years ago. I understood the shape of what he wasn't saying. Lena had been left, not abandoned. Not in the cruel sense, but functionally separated from her mother by distance and deferred promises. Dimitri had become her anchor, and she had become his. The symbiosis between them was visible in every interaction. The way she anticipated his needs, the way he positioned himself between her and any doorway, the way they communicated in half sentences that completed themselves through shared history. On the 4th day, I returned to the unmapped corridor. Alone, this time. Dimitri protested, but I argued that a single person moved more quietly and could retreat faster. The real reason was that I didn't want him to see my reaction. If what lay ahead was something that required composure, I might not have. I followed the branching passage for approximately 150 meters. The draft I'd noticed intensified, carrying something new, a faint organic scent. Not decay exactly, but biological. Warm, like the interior of a greenhouse or the breath of a large animal. The walls widened into a chamber I could only partially illuminate with my flashlight. The ceiling rose beyond the beam's reach. The floor was covered in a fine dust that showed no footprints, no disturbance, no evidence of recent presence. But there were marks on the walls. Not writing, not graffiti, scratches. Parallel lines gouged into concrete at varying heights, some at knee level, some above my head. They were irregular, clustered in groups of 4 or 5, spaced inconsistently along both walls of the chamber. I ran my fingers across one set. The grooves were deep, 3-4 millimeters into solid concrete, and the edges were smooth in a way that suggested they had not been made with tools. Tools leave sharp, angular channels. These were curved, rounded at the base, as if something with extraordinary hardness and a biological curvature had been drawn across the surface with tremendous force. I counted the marks as I moved through the chamber. 47 clusters on the left wall, 31 on the right. No pattern I could identify, no repetition, no message. At the far end of the chamber, I found a second passage continuing deeper. The draft flowed from this direction, steady, warm, pulsing with a rhythm I initially attributed to natural convection. Then I stood still and held my breath and listened. The rhythm wasn't convection. It was breathing. Something was in this tunnel system, something deep, something that had been here long before we arrived. I turned off my flashlight and stood in absolute darkness, listening to something vast exhale in the deep. I did not tell Dimitri and Lena what I heard, not immediately. I returned to C4, reported that the unmapped section extended further than expected and warranted cautious future exploration, and then sat with the transit map for an hour, pretending to update our known boundaries while actually trying to rationalize what I had experienced in that chamber. Sound travels unpredictably underground. Airflow through narrow passages creates acoustic illusions, resonance, amplification, the Helmholtz effect, producing low-frequency oscillations that the human ear interprets as breath-like patterns. I had studied acoustic propagation in tunnel systems as part of my engineering work. I knew the science. I repeated it to myself with the precision of a man reading instructions for a parachute while already falling. It didn't help. The sound had not been mechanical. It had not been wind. It had possessed the irregular cadence of something alive, subtle variations in tempo and depth that no physics of airflow could produce. And the scratches on the walls were not erosion or seismic damage. They were marks of passage, of presence. On the 5th day underground, Lena confronted me directly. She waited until Dimitri had gone to the reservoir to refill our water containers, then sat across from me with her knees drawn up and her eyes fixed on my face with an analytical intensity that made deflection impossible. "You found something in that corridor," she said. "I found an extended section of the complex that—" "Adrian." My name, spoken flatly, without deference. "I watched you come back. You checked the door hinges. You tested the seal on the ventilation grill. You positioned the lantern so it faced the corridor. You've been acting like something might come through that door since yesterday afternoon." I had underestimated her. Badly. "There are marks on the walls deeper in the tunnel," I admitted. "Scratches. Biological in origin, possibly. And there's airflow coming from deep in the system that sounds organic. Infected? I don't know. The infected above. They're recent, days old. Whatever made those marks has been down here long enough for dust to settle undisturbed around them." Lena processed this without visible alarm. She pulled the transit map toward her and studied the eastern section where my documentation ended. "These older tunnels," she said, tracing the unmapped branch with her finger. "Soviet construction, Cold War era. You said they built more than what's documented. Significantly more. There are accounts of entire parallel networks built beneath major cities. Command bunkers, communication lines, troop movement corridors. Most were decommissioned, sealed, and classified. Some were never officially acknowledged. So we're in a shelter system that connects to a deeper military network that may extend for kilometers in directions we can't map. She stated it without inflection. And something is living in it. Something was living in it, I corrected, though the correction felt hollow. The marks could be old. Decades. And the breathing? I had no correction for that. Lena folded the map along its creases with deliberate care and handed it back to me. We need to seal that junction, the bulkhead door where the unmapped section begins. If it can be closed and secured, whatever is deeper stays deeper. She was right. The engineering in me recognized the logic immediately. Isolate the known safe zone from the unknown threat zone. Containment. The most fundamental principle of survival infrastructure. When Dmitri returned, I explained the situation with full transparency. He listened without interrupting, his face settling into the granite expression of a man who had survived Soviet bureaucracy, economic collapse, and the particular endurance required of raising a grandchild alone. When I finished, he set down the water containers and picked up his crowbar. "Show me this door," he said. We reached the bulkhead junction within 10 minutes. The door was heavy. Industrial steel, 40 centimeters thick, mounted on hinges designed to survive blast overpressure. The locking mechanism was a manual wheel, corroded but mechanically intact. Dmitri gripped the wheel and pulled. It moved, barely. Rust and time resisted, but the engineering beneath held true. Soviet manufacturing at its most brutally reliable. Together, we forced the wheel through its full rotation. The bolts engaged with a deep, satisfying resonance that traveled through the steel and into the surrounding concrete. Behind the sealed door, in the darkness beyond, something shifted, a sound like heavy fabric dragging across stone. We looked at each other. Then we walked back to C4 without speaking. The world above reminded us of its existence on the 6th day, not through sound. The depth insulated us from surface noise almost completely. Through smell, a change in the air cycling through the ventilation shafts. Subtle at first, then unmistakable. Chemical, acrid. The specific signature of large-scale combustion filtered through hundreds of meters of ductwork and stone. "The city's burning," Dmitri said, standing beneath the ventilation grill in C4 with his face tilted upward like a man reading weather. He was right. Something massive was on fire above us. Not a single building, but a conflagration wide enough to push smoke into multiple ventilation intake points simultaneously. I checked each of the 4 shafts accessible from our section of the complex. All carried the same taint. Whatever was burning covered an area large enough to encompass the entire surface footprint of our underground position. Lena adjusted the manual dampers on our room's grill, reducing airflow to a trickle. The air quality stabilized, but grew warmer. We would need to balance breathability against contamination, another equation with no comfortable solution. That afternoon, I made a discovery that restructured our understanding of the complex entirely. While inspecting the ventilation hub, a large mechanical room containing the junction points of all 4 shaft systems, I found a secondary chamber concealed behind a rack of corroded filter housings. The chamber door was unmarked, unpainted steel, and it opened inward to reveal a space approximately 4 meters square. Inside was a radio, not a modern communications device. A Soviet-era military field radio, the kind designated for bunker-to-command communication during extended occupation scenarios. It was mounted on a steel desk bolted to the floor, accompanied by a hand-crank generator, a logbook, and a laminated operations card printed in Cyrillic that detailed frequencies and call signs. The equipment was coated in dust but showed no corrosion damage. The sealed room had maintained remarkably stable humidity. I am not a radio operator, but I am an engineer, and the hand-crank generator was mechanically simple. A dynamo system converting rotational energy to electrical current. I turned the crank. Resistance. Then a slight hum. Then a needle on the radio's power gauge lifted from 0 and trembled in the lower third of its range. Static poured from the speaker like water from a broken pipe. I adjusted the frequency dial, moving through the band ranges listed on the operations card. Static across every channel, white noise. The electromagnetic emptiness of a world with no one transmitting. Then, at 4.625 megahertz, a voice. It was faint, buried in interference, speaking in accented English with the clipped cadence of someone reading from a prepared statement. I pressed my ear against the speaker housing and listened. Sustained. Military coordination has collapsed across all sectors. Civilian evacuation corridors are no longer operational. Infection vectors confirm airborne particulate transmission within enclosed environments at advanced stages. All underground shelter occupants are advised to maintain sealed ventilation and avoid surface contact. Governmental authority has been transferred to emergency continuity protocols. This message will repeat. The message cycled. I listened to it 3 times, writing key phrases on the back of the transit map with a pencil stub. Then I turned the dial further, at 6.140 megahertz. A different voice. Female, not reading a statement, speaking freely, with the raw edge of someone who had been talking into the void without certainty of an audience. If anyone is receiving this, we are in the storm drainage system beneath the industrial quarter. 14 people. We have water but no food. The infected have entered the drainage network from the river outflow. They are in the tunnels. Repeat, they are in the tunnels. We are moving deeper, but we cannot. The transmission cut to static. I sat in that small room for a long time after that, my hand still on the frequency dial, listening to the empty hiss between stations. The first broadcast had given me information. The second had given me something worse. Context. We were not the only ones who had gone underground, and underground was not safe. I returned to C4 and told Dmitri and Lena everything. This time, I held nothing back. The radio changed the psychology of our shelter. Before its discovery, we had existed in a kind of informational vacuum that, while frightening, allowed a certain insulation. We could imagine the surface stabilizing. We could construct hypothetical rescue timelines. The vacuum permitted hope because it permitted ignorance. The radio eliminated that privilege. Lena became the primary radio monitor. She volunteered for the role with a quiet authority that neither Dmitri nor I thought to challenge. She spent hours in the radio room, slowly cranking the generator with one hand while scanning frequencies with the other, cataloging every signal she received in the logbook with neat, precise handwriting. Within 2 days, she had mapped the broadcast landscape. The emergency government loop on 4.625 continued its mechanical repetition. A second automated signal on 3.880 broadcast navigational warnings for maritime vessels in 7 languages, suggesting that whatever authority maintained coastal infrastructure still functioned in some reduced capacity. A fragmented military communication on 7.200 discussed perimeter lines and withdrawal orders in a Slavic language Dmitri identified as Serbian, indicating the crisis extended well beyond our national borders. and scattered across the bands, like stars in an otherwise black sky, were the individual voices, survivors. Small groups in basements and rooftops and drainage systems and sealed apartments, transmitting with improvised equipment or repurposed commercial radios. Speaking to no one and everyone, narrating their circumstances into the electromagnetic spectrum with a desperate faith that being heard was a form of survival. Lena recorded their positions when they gave them. She noted their numbers, their conditions, their resources. She created a ledger of the living that grew denser each day, and then, gradually, began to thin as voices dropped off the bands and did not return. "She shouldn't be listening to that," Dmitri said to me on the 7th night. We were in the corridor, speaking in our customary whisper while Lena slept. His face, in the lantern light, had aged visibly in the weeks since we descended. The deep lines around his eyes had become trenches, and his jaw held a permanent tension that spoke of clenched teeth maintained through waking hours. "She chose it," I said. "She's 17. She's the most competent person in this complex, and you know it." He did know it. The knowledge sat in his expression alongside the helpless recognition that competence could not substitute for protection. And that protection was the one thing he had always understood as his purpose regarding Lena. "I can't keep her safe from information," he said. "No, but you can keep being the person she comes back to when the information gets heavy." He considered this, nodded once, and returned to his position by the door. On the 8th day, the sealed bulkhead door became relevant again. I had been avoiding the eastern end of the corridor, keeping our activities concentrated in the mapped western section. But during a routine inspection of the corridor walls, checking for moisture intrusion or structural changes, I noticed something near the bulkhead that stopped me mid-stride. The dust on the floor in front of the sealed door had been disturbed. Not by us. Our footprints from 3 days prior were clearly visible, overlaid by fresh settling. This disturbance was different. A broad swath of displaced dust, roughly a meter wide, emanating from the narrow gap beneath the door, as if something had pressed against the door from the other side with enough force to push air, and dust, through the millimeter clearance at the threshold. I knelt and examined the gap. The clearance between the door's bottom edge and the concrete floor was perhaps 5 millimeters. Through it, I felt a faint warmth that had no business existing in an underground passage with no heating infrastructure. I placed my ear against the cold steel. Nothing. Then, not a sound, but a vibration. A tremor transmitted through the metal itself, so low in frequency it registered more as a pressure change in the inner ear than an audible tone. It came in pulses, irregular, organic. The thing behind this door was touching it. I stood, backed away, and for the first time since we arrived, considered the possibility that our sealed refuge was not a shelter, was a shared space. I called a meeting. The formality of the term felt absurd in a concrete room occupied by 3 people, but the gravity of the conversation demanded structure. I laid out the transit map, now annotated with Lena's radio intelligence and my own observations, and presented our situation with the clinical directness of an engineering assessment. "There is something alive on the other side of that bulkhead," I said. "It has been present since before our arrival. It appears to be large, based on the scale of the wall markings I observed. It is aware of the door and has made physical contact with it. The door is holding, but we need to discuss contingencies." Dimitri's response was immediate and characteristically practical. "Can it breach the door?" "The door is rated for blast overpressure. Assuming the locking mechanism remains intact, the failure point would be the hinges or the surrounding concrete, not the door itself. It would take extraordinary sustained force to compromise either. Then it stays on its side and we stay on ours. That's the baseline plan. But we have vulnerabilities. The ventilation system connects our section to the deeper network through ductwork that passes through and beyond the bulkhead's partition wall. The ducts are 40 centimeters in diameter, too small for anything of significant size. But we can't confirm what's down there or what dimensions it operates within. Lena had been listening with the focused stillness I had come to associate with her processing mode. Now she spoke. The scratches you described, varying heights, some at knee level, some above your head. Correct. That doesn't sound like one thing. That sounds like multiple things of different sizes, or one thing that operates at different heights. Climbing, crawling, reaching. The observation was sharp enough to cut. I hadn't considered it, and it reframed the threat model entirely. A single large organism was one category of problem. Multiple organisms, or a single adaptive organism capable of navigating varied spatial configurations, was another category altogether. We need more information, Lena continued, and we're not going to get it by staying on this side of the door. Absolutely not, Dmitri said with a finality that compressed the words into stone. I'm not suggesting we open it. I'm suggesting we use the ventilation system to observe. Adrian said the ducts pass beyond the bulkhead. If we access the ventilation hub and trace the ductwork, we might find an inspection point. A grill, a junction, a service hatch. That gives us a visual into the deeper section without breaching our sealed perimeter. She was right again. And again, the engineering in me recognized the logic before the fear could object. Reconnaissance without exposure. Information gathering without risk escalation. The ventilation hub was within our secured zone, and the ductwork offered passive observation capability if we could identify the right access point. We went to the ventilation hub together. All three of us. Dmitri refused to split the group now, and I agreed. The hub was a mechanical cathedral. 4 massive shaft columns rising vertically through the ceiling toward the surface, interconnected by a web of horizontal ducts that branched throughout the complex. I traced the ductwork on the map, correlating physical junctions with blueprint notation, until I identified a horizontal run that passed through the partition wall and continued into the unmapped eastern section. The duct had an inspection panel at the partition boundary, a removable plate secured by wing nuts, designed for maintenance access. I opened it carefully, the metal protesting with a squeal that echoed through the duct system like a scream in a cathedral. Beyond the panel, the duct continued into darkness. The warm draft flowed through it, stronger here, carrying that same biological scent. Richer now, concentrated, humid. I aimed my flashlight into the duct. The beam traveled 10 meters before hitting a junction where the duct turned downward at a sharp angle. I couldn't see beyond the turn, but I could hear sounds, not breathing this time. Movement, multiple sources, a wet, sliding friction, like damp skin against concrete, accompanied by intermittent clicking, rapid, rhythmic, communicative. Something down there was not just living. It was organized. I closed the inspection panel, tightened the wing nuts, and stepped back. We need to seal every duct penetration in our section, I said. Tonight, we worked through what we estimated was the entire night, sealing every ventilation penetration in our occupied zone with materials scavenged from the equipment rooms. Dmitri's plumbing expertise proved invaluable. He fabricated gaskets from rubber sheeting stripped from decommissioned pipe insulation, used them to create airtight seals around the duct grills in C4, and secured each seal with mechanical clamps fashioned from electrical panel hardware. The work was exhausting, precise, and performed in near silence, as if the act of sealing ourselves away from what lay deeper required a reverence that precluded speech. By the time we finished, our section was ventilated only through the 4 vertical surface shafts, with all lateral duct connections to the eastern complex blocked. Air quality would remain viable. The surface shafts drew from multiple intake points and provided adequate circulation for our small group. But we had traded observation capability for isolation. The ducts were no longer windows into the deeper tunnels. They were walls. The cost became apparent the next morning when Lena reported a change in the radio landscape. The woman from the storm drainage system, the one whose transmission had been cut short, was broadcasting again. Her voice was different now, slower, the urgency replaced by something hollow and procedural. There are 9 of us remaining. We lost 5 in the night. The infected in the drainage tunnels are not like the ones on the surface. They are faster. They do not respond to light or sound deterrents. They coordinate. They flank. They waited until we split into 2 groups for water collection and struck the smaller group simultaneously. Carlos, Miguel, the woman named Petra, and 2 others whose names I did not learn. I am telling you their names because someone should know them. My name is Alina. I am a hydraulic engineer. I am 38 years old. If this is the last time I transmit, someone should know my name too. Lena transcribed the message in full, her handwriting steady and unchanged. When she finished, she closed the logbook and sat with her hands flat on the desk surface, fingers spread, as if grounding herself through physical contact with something solid. "They coordinate," she said. I was standing in the doorway of the radio room. The word echoed what I had heard through the duct. The clicking, the organized movement, the unmistakable pattern of communication rather than mere animal behavior. The infected? That's what Alina said. Flanking maneuvers, coordinated timing. That's not pathological aggression. That's tactical. Above ground. They weren't like that, I said. I watched them for 4 days from my apartment. They moved in clusters driven by stimulus, sound, light, movement. Pack behavior, not tactics. Above ground, Lena repeated. What about below? The question opened a fissure in my understanding that I could not close. The infection, whatever it was, had been assumed to degrade cognitive function. Every account, every piece of footage, every official communication had described the infected as driven by stripped-down, predatory impulse. Chase, bite, spread. The neurological mechanism was understood to be destructive, not transformative. But Alina's account suggested something different occurring underground. And the sounds I had heard through the duct, the clicking, the organized patterns, supported the suggestion. What if the infection, in certain conditions, didn't merely degrade? What if it continued to develop? What if the subterranean environment, with its stable temperature, its darkness, its isolation from the chaos of surface stimuli, provided conditions under which the infection could progress into stages that surface-dwelling infected never reached? I shared this theory with Dmitri. He listened with the expression of a man being told that the foundation he's standing on is built over a sinkhole. "You're saying the things below us are smarter than the things above us," he said. "I'm saying they might be different, more developed. Further along whatever trajectory the infection follows when it isn't interrupted by exposure, violence, or environmental stress. And they've been developing down here, in the dark. For how long? The Meridian star had docked 12 days ago. But the scratches in the deep chamber were coated in settled dust. They were not 12 days old. They were months old, perhaps longer. Whatever was below us had not arrived with the outbreak. The outbreak had arrived with it. On the 11th day, the dynamics of our 3-person community shifted in a way that no structural engineering could have predicted or reinforced. The catalyst was Lena's medication. She had rationed carefully, but the mathematics were unforgiving. At her prescribed dosage of twice daily, the remaining supply would last 9 more days. After that, the risk of breakthrough seizures would escalate rapidly. Without medication, without medical oversight, a seizure in a concrete bunker represented a danger not just to Lena's health, but to the operational viability of our group. Dimitri's response to this timeline was immediate and absolute. We go to the surface. We find a pharmacy. We come back. The surface is compromised, I said. The city is burning. The infected. I know what the surface is. I also know what happens to my granddaughter without her medication. Dimitri, don't. He held up his hand, and the gesture carried the weight of a man who had spent 64 years learning exactly where his non-negotiable boundaries stood. This is not a discussion. This is a schedule. We have 9 days to plan a surface expedition. I need you to help me plan it. That's all I need from you. I looked at Lena. She sat against the wall with her arms wrapped around her knees, watching us with an expression that mixed gratitude with something more complex. A recognition that her body's requirements were now dictating the group's risk exposure, and that this fact produced a specific variety of guilt that no reassurance could dissolve. There's a pharmacy on Volkov Street, she said quietly, 4 blocks east of the station entrance. I filled my prescription there every month. It's small, independent, less likely to have been looted than the chains. Practical, specific, actionable. Even in the discussion of her own vulnerability, Lena defaulted to contribution. We spent 3 days planning the expedition. I used the transit map and my knowledge of the station's upper levels to plot a route. Up through the maintenance shaft to the mezzanine level, through the staff corridor to the platform, up the motionless escalators to the surface concourse, and out through the main entrance. Estimated round trip to the pharmacy and back. 40 minutes if the streets were navigable, 90 if they required detours. Dimitri would go. This was not negotiable, and I did not attempt to negotiate it. His physical capability, while diminished by age, was augmented by a determination that operated outside rational assessment. I would accompany him to the surface threshold and maintain the route for return, positioned at the top of the maintenance shaft as both lookout and guide. Lena would remain in C4 with the radio and a barricaded door. I want to come, she said on the second planning day. No, Dimitri and I said simultaneously. The only moment of complete synchronization we had achieved since descending. You need me. I know the pharmacy's layout. I know exactly where my medication is shelved. Section 3, second row, bottom shelf, behind the counter. You won't find it without... You'll draw us a diagram, Dimitri said. She drew the diagram. It was meticulous. Floor plan, counter position, shelf designations, medication name and packaging description. She included the location of the pharmacy's rear exit in case the front entrance was blocked, the position of a storage closet that could serve as temporary refuge, and the sight lines from the front windows that would allow assessment of street conditions before committing to entry. When did you become a tactical planner? I asked. I've been planning around obstacles my entire life, she said without elaboration. On the 14th day, 9 days of medication remaining, we woke to begin preparations and found that the situation had changed. During the night, while all 3 of us slept, something had come to our section of the corridor. Not through the bulkhead. It remained sealed, bolts engaged, undisturbed. Not through the ventilation. Our seals were intact. Through a route we hadn't known existed. In the dust of the corridor floor, 30 meters from our door, a trail of marks led from a shadow-filled gap between 2 equipment cabinets I had assumed were flush against the wall. Behind those cabinets, concealed by their bulk, was a narrow passage, perhaps 60 centimeters wide. descending at a steep angle into stone. Something had come up through it, and then gone back down. The marks in the dust told a story I didn't want to read. They weren't footprints, not in any configuration that mapped onto human locomotion. They were broad, smeared impressions, as if whatever had moved through the corridor contacted the floor with large, flat surfaces, palms, or something functionally equivalent, distributed across a wide base. The trail moved from the hidden passage to a point approximately 10 meters from the door of C4, paused there. The dust compression was deeper, suggesting sustained weight, and then returned to the passage. It had come. It had stopped near our door, and it had left. "Why?" Lena asked. She was crouched over the marks with the flashlight, studying them with the focused composure that had become her defining characteristic. If it could reach our door, why didn't it try? "Maybe it didn't know we were here," Dmitri offered, though his voice lacked conviction. "It knew," I said. "We breathe, we move, we produce heat. In an environment this stable and this quiet, our biological presence is detectable. It came to observe, not to act." "Reconnaissance," Lena said. The word hung in the corridor air with a weight that exceeded its syllables. Reconnaissance implied intention. It implied assessment. It implied a decision-making process that distinguished between observation and engagement, between information gathering and action. It implied that whatever existed in the deep tunnels beneath us operated with a cognitive framework sophisticated enough to delay gratification in favor of strategic advantage. I sealed the hidden passage. Dmitri and I moved the equipment cabinets into the corridor and packed the gap with debris, concrete chunks from a collapsed corner in one of the unused rooms, lengths of pipe, anything with mass and resistance. We built a barrier 2 meters deep and wedged it tight. It was not elegant. It would not hold against sustained, determined force. But it would make noise. It would give us warning. That afternoon, I sat with the transit map and confronted a new reality. Our secured perimeter was an illusion. The complex's Soviet-era construction included passages and connections that didn't appear on any documentation I possessed. The hidden passage behind the cabinets was not on my map. It had no corresponding notation in the logbook. It existed as pure infrastructure, built, used for some unknown purpose, and then concealed behind equipment that had stood undisturbed for decades. How many other concealed passages existed in our section? How many routes connected the mapped complex to the unmapped depths below? The answer was unknowable with our current resources. And that unknowability transformed every wall, every corner, every shadow into a potential entry point. "We can't stay here," I said. Dmitri looked up from the barrier. His hands were raw from moving concrete. Dust whitened his hair and beard, giving him the appearance of a carved figure emerging from stone. "We have water. We have food for another week. We have walls and a sealed door. We have walls we can't trust. The deep complex connects to this level through routes I can't map. What came up last night could come up anywhere, through passages we haven't found yet. So where do we go? Up, to the surface. Not just for Lena's medication, for relocation. We find a defensible position that doesn't sit on top of an unknown network of tunnels occupied by something we don't understand. The silence that followed was the loudest sound our shelter had produced. It contained the weight of 11 days of accumulated investment, the water reservoir discovery, the radio, the sealed ducts, the organized supplies, the routines that had given structure to our subterranean existence. Leaving meant abandoning all of it. Leaving meant admitting that my expertise, my knowledge of these tunnels, had led us not to safety, but to proximity with something far more dangerous than the infected on the streets above. Lena broke the silence. Tomorrow morning, first light equivalent. We take what we can carry. Water, food, medication, the radio logbook. We go up, we assess, and we don't come back down unless the surface is worse. Dmitri looked at her. Something passed between them. A communication that operated below language, in the register of blood and years and shared survival. Tomorrow morning, he agreed. I nodded and began planning our ascent. Behind the debris barrier, in the hidden passage, something scraped against stone. Listening. We prepared through the night. Each of us packed a single bag with ration precision. Lena oversaw the distribution, with the systematic competence she brought to every task. Water. 6 liters divided equally. Food. Canned goods selected for caloric density, enough for 3 days. Medical supplies. Lena's remaining medication. Bandages, purification tablets. Tools. Dimitri's crowbar, my multi-tool, the flashlights, the lantern. Intelligence. The radio logbook, the annotated transit map, a pencil. I made one final visit to the radio room. The hand crank generator whined as I scanned the frequencies one last time. The government loop continued its mechanical recitation. The maritime warnings persisted. The individual voices had thinned further. I counted only 3 transmissions across a full band sweep, down from 11 at Lena's peak census. One of the 3 was Alina, the hydraulic engineer in the drainage system. Her voice had changed again, quieter, methodical, stripped of the emotional weight that had characterized her earlier broadcasts. She spoke with the flat precision of someone documenting events for a record that might never be read. Day 14. 7 remaining. The coordinated infected in the drainage network have established what I can only describe as territorial boundaries. They do not pursue beyond certain points. They patrol. They maintain positions. We have mapped their perimeter and identified a corridor. They do not enter a section of the drainage tunnel that slopes upward toward the Eastern Industrial District. We are moving through it today. If we reach the surface, we will attempt a signal from the rooftop of the Dzerzhinsky factory complex. Frequency 6.140. Alina out. I wrote down the factory name and frequency. Then I shut down the radio, closed the room, and stood for a moment in the ventilation hub, surrounded by the mechanical infrastructure that had sustained us. The 4 shaft columns rose into darkness above me, carrying air from a surface I was about to rejoin. Through them, faintly, I could smell rain. It was raining above. The fires had stopped, or the weather had overwhelmed them. Rain meant reduced visibility. Rain meant sound masking. Rain meant the infected sensory advantages were diminished. We go now, I told Dmitri and Lena when I returned to C4. It's raining. Best conditions we'll get. We moved through the central corridor in formation. Me in front with the flashlight, Lena in the middle, Dmitri at the rear with the crowbar. The corridor, which had become familiar through 11 days of habitation, now felt like a place we were visiting for the last time. The walls, the conduit piping, the numbered room markers, all of it receding into memory as we walked. At the maintenance stairwell, I paused and looked back. The corridor stretched behind us, amber lit by the lantern we had left burning in C4 as a final gesture of occupancy. 60 meters of concrete and silence and shelter that had kept us alive while the surface burned. And beyond it, past the debris barrier, past the sealed bulkhead, past the scratched chamber and the breathing darkness, the deep complex continued. Whatever lived there had observed us, assessed us, and chosen not to act. I did not understand why. The not understanding was perhaps the most frightening element of our entire experience. More frightening than the sounds, the marks, the nocturnal visit. The infected on the surface operated on comprehensible impulse. The things below operated on something else entirely. Intention without readable motive. Intelligence without recognizable framework. I turned away and began climbing. The stairwell took 11 minutes, ascending longer than the descent, burdened by packs and the deconditioning of 11 days in a confined space. My legs burned by the second level. Dimitri's breathing grew labored by the third. Only Lena maintained her pace, moving with the efficient biomechanics of youth and discipline. At the top, the staff corridor was dark but structurally intact. The air here was different. Surface air carrying rain and smoke and the unmistakable organic undertone of a city in decomposition. We moved through it toward the platform level. The station was empty. The amber emergency lights still glowed. The escalators stood motionless, ascending toward gray daylight, and the sound of rain striking stone. I looked at Dimitri. He adjusted his grip on the crowbar. "Together," he said. We climbed toward the sky. The surface was a landscape rendered in ash and water. Rain fell in steady vertical sheets through air gray with particulate matter, coating every surface in a slick film that turned the streets into shallow rivers flowing toward blocked storm drains. The buildings flanking the station entrance stood intact but transformed. Windows shattered, facades scorched in patterns that suggested fire had moved through the area in waves, advancing and retreating with the shifting dynamics of uncontrolled urban combustion. Cars lined the streets in positions of abandonment, doors open, interiors dark, their surfaces pebbled with rain impact. No movement, no sound beyond the rain. The infected were not visible. "Stay close to the walls," I whispered. "Folkoff Street is 4 blocks east. We move quickly." We moved. 3 figures pressed against building facades, stepping over debris and through ankle-deep water, navigating by memory and Lena's hand-drawn map. The pharmacy was exactly where she had indicated. A narrow storefront with a green cross sign hanging at an angle, front window intact but door ajar. I checked sight lines, scanned the street in both directions, and signaled entry. Inside, the pharmacy was ransacked but not destroyed. Shelves had been swept, floor-level stock pulled and scattered, the obvious targets. Painkillers, antibiotics, stimulants, cleaned out entirely. But Lena's intelligence proved surgical. The prescription counter in section 3, second row, bottom shelf, behind the register where customers didn't typically access, held a stock of her specific anticonvulsant, 4 boxes, 3 months of supply. She gathered them with steady hands and packed them into her bag without ceremony. "Anything else useful?" Dimitri said, already scanning the remaining stock with a forager's eye. He pulled bandages, antiseptic, a box of water purification tablets, and a bottle of broad-spectrum antibiotics that had rolled beneath a display stand. I found batteries that fit our flashlights and a small first aid manual in laminated pages that would survive moisture. We were in the pharmacy for 6 minutes. On the 7th minute, Lena touched my arm and pointed toward the front window. Across the street, in the doorway of a gutted electronics store, a figure stood in the rain. It was human in outline. 2 arms, 2 legs, upright posture. But its proportions were subtly wrong. The limbs were elongated, the torso compressed, the head tilted at an angle that exceeded normal cervical range. It was motionless, watching. "Don't move," I breathed. We stood frozen behind the pharmacy counter, partially obscured by the register display. The figure in the doorway remained still. Rain struck its surface and ran off in channels that suggested its skin, or whatever coated its body, was smooth, non-porous. Then it stepped forward. 1 step, into the rain, into the street, into the full gray light of the afternoon. And I saw it clearly for the first time. Saw what the infection had become when given time, when given darkness, when given the subterranean conditions I had theorized about. Its skin was translucent. Beneath it, structures moved, not organs in the traditional sense, but organized formations of dark tissue that pulsed with coordinated rhythm. Its fingers were extended, each easily 30 centimeters long, tapering to points that matched the curvature of the scratches I had seen on the tunnel walls. Its eyes, if they were eyes, were recessed, covered by a membrane that appeared to vibrate rather than blink. It was not a recently infected person. It was something further along the trajectory, something that had progressed through stages the surface infected never reached, something that had come from below. It tilted its head further, orienting toward the pharmacy. Then it opened its mouth, a vertical slit that extended from where the chin would have been to well above what had once been a nose, and produced the clicking sound I had heard through the ductor. Rapid, rhythmic, communicative. And from doorways, from windows, from drains and alleys up and down Volkov Street, clicks answered. Back entrance, Lena said with absolute calm. Now, we ran. Through the storage closet, through the rear door, into the alley behind Volkov Street, into the rain and the ruins, and the terrible understanding that the deep was not confined to the deep. It had surfaced. The alley behind Volkov Street was narrow, choked with dumpsters and collapsed fire escapes, and it saved our lives. The clicking spread through the main street like a chain reaction, dozens of responses cascading from every direction, triangulating on the pharmacy with a precision that confirmed coordinated hunting behavior. But the alley's acoustic properties were different. The tight walls and overhead obstructions created a sound shadow that muffled our movement and disrupted the echolocation I now understood the clicking to represent. We ran without strategy, driven by pure kinetic survival. Dmitri moved with a speed that defied his age, the crowbar clutched diagonally across his chest, his boots striking puddles with controlled force. Lena ran ahead of both of us, navigating turns and obstacles with an instinctive spatial awareness that I could not match. I brought up the rear, my engineer's mind racing through structural calculations, even in flight. Clearance widths, dead-end probabilities, route options extrapolated from my knowledge of the surrounding block layout. Left at the junction, I called. It connects to Pushkin Avenue. Wider street, more cover options. We turned left. Pushkin Avenue opened before us. Broad, devastated, and momentarily empty. The rain was intensifying, visibility dropping to perhaps 50 meters. We paused in the shelter of a collapsed awning, gasping, scanning. The station is 2 blocks north, Lena said between breaths. Straight line. Straight lines get you killed, Dmitri growled. He was watching the rooftops. I followed his gaze and saw why. On the edge of a 4-story apartment building, silhouetted against the gray sky, 3 figures stood in a row. Motionless, tilted, watching. They were on the rooftops. They could climb. They had taken high ground. They're hurting us, I said. And the realization carried the nauseous weight of prey, recognizing the geometry of predation. The clicking on Volkov Street had not been pursuit. It had been displacement. They had driven us out of the pharmacy, out of the alley, into the open avenue, where elevated observers could track our movement and direct ground-level elements to intercept. Move now, Dmitri ordered. He took the lead, crowbar raised, and we ran north on Pushkin Avenue. The station entrance appeared through the rain like a monument to a civilization that had ended while we hid underground. The Soviet arch, the ornamental pillars, the wide mouth descending into the earth. Dmitri reached it first and turned to cover our approach. Lena was 3 steps behind him. I was 10 steps behind her. That was when the ground-level element arrived. It came from beneath a collapsed transit kiosk 20 meters to my right. Unfolding from a space that should not have contained anything of its size, moving with a fluidity that made human locomotion look mechanical by comparison. It crossed the wet pavement in absolute silence, its elongated fingers splayed, its vertical mouth open, clicking. Dmitri stepped forward and swung the crowbar in a horizontal arc that connected with the thing's extended arm. The impact produced a sound like wet wood splitting, and the arm folded at an angle that confirmed the internal structure was no longer skeletal in any recognizable sense. The creature staggered but did not fall. It recalibrated, oriented on Dmitri. Clicked once. Sharp, loud, summoning. "Go!" Dmitri shouted. He swung again, driving the creature back a step. "Both of you, go down. Now!" Lena grabbed my arm and pulled me into the station entrance. My feet found the motionless escalator steps. We descended into darkness. Behind us, I heard Dmitri's boots on the marble concourse, his breathing, the crowbar striking, striking, striking. Then his footsteps on the escalator. Coming down, following. He emerged from the gray light into the amber glow of the station platform. Crowbar bent, breathing like a furnace, his left arm hanging at an angle that told me something had connected before he broke free. "Arms dislocated," he said through his teeth. "Don't stop." We didn't stop. Down through the staff corridor, down through the maintenance shaft, down, 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 into the deep we had just fled. Because above us, clicking cascaded through the station entrance like water pouring into a drain. They were following, and they were fast. We sealed the maintenance shaft behind us with every obstruction we could find. Dmitri's arm hung useless at his side, while Lena fashioned a sling from her jacket with the decisive efficiency of someone who had always prepared for the moment. Everything depended on her. The clicking above us faded. Whether they had stopped pursuing or simply stopped making sound, I could not determine. We are back in C4 now. The door is barricaded. Lena has her medication. Dmitri is resting with his back against the wall, the crowbar balanced across his knees with his functional hand. The lantern burns between us, throwing our shadows onto concrete walls that I no longer trust. I know now what lives beneath this city. I know it was here before the outbreak, that the infection began in the deep and rose to the surface like pressure finding a crack. I know that the tunnels extend further than any blueprint records, and that within them, something has been evolving in the dark for longer than anyone suspected. We cannot go up. We cannot stay. But Lena is already studying the transit map, tracing routes I haven't considered, finding passages I overlooked. She is planning our next movement with a calm that makes me believe in survival. Not as a guarantee, but as a discipline. We move at dawn, whatever dawn means down here. If you enjoy listening to zombie stories regularly, make sure to subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon so you don't miss any updates. And don't forget to let us know in the comments how you liked this story.